Okay, we're going to do Perek Chavches 28. So we changed track here a little bit.
From the beginning?
From the beginning of 28, yeah.
No, but it's not from the beginning. From the beginning of 28.
Yeah, yeah. Chapter 28, yeah. So, chapter Chavav, Chav Zayin, Chav Ches, 26, 27. No, I'm sorry. I mean 29, sorry. Yeah, 29, sorry. 29. Okay. Let's start again. 26, 27, and 28 was... So, up until 26 was about really the establishing how you become a Beinani, the fight of Nefesh al-Kis, Nefesh Abamis, animal soul, godly soul, the ways to develop love for Hashem. The last number of chapters from 18 to 25 was about how to connect to the intrinsic love, what we call the hidden love, the Ava Masateres, even if someone is not fully intellectual enough to process all the intellectual journey to really reflect, to give birth to a love of Hashem and so on, all that kind of stuff, right? So that was until 25. 25 we finished that because that was the idea of Mesiras Nefesh, connecting with our Etzim of Anashama, realizing that's where Emunah is, and for Avodah Zarah we would give up everything, and we came to understand that how the oneness of Hashem means everything that's outside of the oneness of Hashem is like Avodah Zarah, so therefore every mitzvah is like Anochi Hashem Alekecha, every Aveira is like Avodah Zarah. That was the whole process. Okay. And that really finished a very important, like really the journey from Perek Aleph, from chapter 1, really ended with 25 to answer all the questions. Why we say that Hashem created tzaddikim, it doesn't mean that. It means that because you can't really become a tzaddik on your own, the pursuit is a Beinani, but you can have tzaddik moments, all that kind of stuff. Okay. Perek 26, Perek Chavav, we started the journey to talk about things that stand in the way. So you know what to do, we know how to think, we know the perspective, we know the mindset. Then there are things that are going to stand in the way. One of them is sadness. We get bogged down with feelings that cause us not to be happy. So he spent 3 chapters explaining that no, simcha is the only way to serve Hashem. It's the only way to make those choices and to win the war between the Nefesh al-Kis and the Nefesh Abamis. He gave the mashal that if 2 people are fighting, if one's heavy and sad, they'll lose even to a weaker person. And therefore he went through a whole bunch of things. And there were different types of causes of sadness. Sadness can come from physical challenges. That's one perspective, that's one mindset. He talked about the hidden good, and everything is ultimately good, and so on. He talked about the spiritual challenges, and then he spoke about different types of spiritual challenges. The idea was to understand that it's not the way to do it. You have to have designated times to feel uncomfortable for Averis, and so on, but otherwise it has to be b'simcha. And then we talked about the sudden negative thoughts that a Beinani has, even if it's a Beinani, which means even if he doesn't sustain those thoughts, which means they're not really Averis, but the person's upset why they suddenly falling into his head. So there were 2 aspects of that. One aspect was when they fall into your head just during the day, right? The person is upset, why come? Why? It means something wrong with me. If I'm having these Aveira momentary thoughts during the day, that means something wrong with me. And therefore he says, no, that's not true. It's just about, that's a Beinani. You've got to always fight the war, right? And then the last one was Hirurim, thoughts that are Aveirah, or initial Aveirah thoughts. You don't sustain them, but as we said, if you sustain them, then it goes back to the time of a sadness from Aveirah. But when a person is plagued with thoughts during davening, where he therefore thinks that the davening is not being accepted by Hashem and he can't daven properly, the strategy is total dismissal of the thoughts. It's just a test that Hashem, the more person is davening, the more the Nefesh Abamis is standing in the way. It's like someone standing outside the window and trying to distract you while you're davening, you just have to ignore them. Right? That was the essence of these 3 chapters. Now, it turns track completely. Surgeon's warning. This is going to be on the surface, not so comfortable. Because Alter is going to call on us to do something which is a little hard. But he's first going to explain why you need to do it. So, it says like it's Perich Chavtes. Ach oid achas tzorich loshis eitzois benafshay. Habeinanim. Another strategy you need to develop for the soul of the Beinanim. Asher lifa'omim sometimes, the itim rabim many times, sometimes or many times, depending on what level you are, I guess. Yesh lahem, the Beinani might have, and how much more so if you're less than the Beinani, but even the Beinani. Yesh lahem timtum halev. Timtum halev means a blockage of the heart, right? What does that mean? It means shenase ke'even, that the heart becomes like a stone. V'lo yochel liftoyach liboy. And what's the consequence of that blockage of the heart? That he cannot open up his heart b'shum oifen in any way la'avodah shebelev zu tefillah, for the avodah of the heart, which is tefillah, which is davening. What does that mean? Let's just understand this, what he's talking about. So when he talks about the heart being blocked, he's talking about the nefesh habamis. Right? In other words, a person, I mean, there is such a thing about a blockage of the mind also, but now he's talking about the blockage of the heart. In other words, a person can, let's say, be a Beinani. Again, how much more so less than a Beinani, but even a Beinani can sometimes be in complete control of machshava, dibur, ma'aseh, right? Thought, speech, and action, he will not do anything wrong. He's exercised what the Tanya has told us, that moyach shalit ala lev, the brain rules the heart, and he's really on the page. But we know that critical to a Beinani, to sustain that, is the idea of tefillah, davening. Davening is the emotional experience. Davening is a time where we explode with the nefesh elokis, and we also try and influence the nefesh habamis, right? Because it's emotional. That's the idea. I've explained this before. That's one of the reasons why in davening we talk about the malachim, right? Because malachim are also animals, and in fact, not only the animals, they're holy animals, but they are the source from which the nefesh habamis evolves, right? We've talked about this before. So that's a really important, critical component of the avodah of the Beinani, is the avodah of tefillah. The problem is that tefillah is called avodah shebelev. It's an emotional experience. Tefillah means, right? Tefillah means that you have concepts in your head which then need to be absorbed by the heart. That is tefillah. It's about emotional connection with Hashem. That's why it's also about influencing and getting the nefesh habamis inside, right? Sometimes, however, the nefesh elokis is doing really well, but there's a blockage of the heart. The blockage of the heart is that it's not letting it absorb. It just doesn't absorb. Right? And therefore the Beinani finds it hard to daven. Then he says, the gamli fa'amim sometimes lo yuchal le'ilachim ha'yetzer. The Beinani's find it really difficult to sanctify himself as something that's permissible because of the heaviness of the heart. What does he mean by that? So by a Beinani, by a Yid in general, but by a Beinani in particular, right? The temptation to do an Aveira is radically different from the temptation to indulge in something that is permissible. Right? There was an expression in Tanya, or maybe it hasn't been yet in Tanya. No, I think it has been. I think so. Where he says that the Yetzer Hara to do something bad, right, is a foreign ghost. Use the word shade. The shade is like a ghost. It's a non-Jewish ghost. In other words, it's not a Jewish ghost. What does that mean? A Yid doesn't want to do something against Hashem's will, right? And Aveira is something that Hashem says, this is klippa, you're not allowed to do this, it's treif, you can't eat it, it's Shabbos, you can't break it. Whatever, all these things, right? It's in a relationship you can't have. It's an Aveira. It's outright Aveira. It's clear that it's against the Ratzon of Hashem. That is easier to overcome. I mean, we don't always overcome it, of course, it's still a struggle. And even being a Beinani, even in that regard, is a very difficult and high level, and we don't always make it, but at least we're on that level, right? We're on that road, at least, right? Where it's very difficult is in the grey area, which is the mitzvah that Hashem gave us in the Torah, kedoshim to you, to bring holiness, something that's permissible. In other words, Hashem is saying this is not treif. This is not forbidden. It's mutter. To eat a banana is okay. This cake is kosher, 100% with the best aksha. But you still got to be holy with it. That's very difficult. Right? That's what he calls in Tanya the Jewish struggle. To give in to the Yetzer Hara for an Avera, that's the non-Jewish struggle, really. It's not really for a Yid. The Yid knows doesn't do an Avera, finished. That doesn't like, you understand? But the Jewish struggle really is I mean, not in its ultimate sense, but we see this today in a very, very big way. There are people that are Shomer Torah mitzvahs. They are frum, they're Shomer Shabbos, Kashrus, family purity. They keep Shulchan Aruch, they might learn, have a shir day. The biggest test for them is the temptation of indulgence. It's very simple, right? And materialism. They can be very frum, but nevertheless, materialism is the real thing. Okay, being very frum doesn't mean you're a Benini and Averis either. Right? I mean, because Benini means you never give in to your Yetzer Hara. But okay, but I'm just saying that contrast between things that are forbidden and things that are permissible is very clear, right? For which the Benini, part of the overcoming of that means a lot of davening. Davening is particularly important about connection, love of Hashem, really filling yourself with complete love of Hashem, and therefore really wanting to hate anything that is, or intolerant of anything that is distant, that makes you distant from Hashem, which includes indulgence in something which is permissible, right? So sometimes when a person has timtum halev, the blockage of the heart, it's hard to daven, number one, and then also it's very hard sometimes to win the war about not doing averis. That could be fine, but to win the war about being mekadesh yourself, sanctifying yourself in even permissible things. Why? Because there's a heavy heart, and the heavy heart's coming because the heart is blocked. Yeah. By the way, he calls it leiv ha'evan, the heart of stone, right? What does he mean by stone? Because sometimes the good heart is called leiv bosar, heart of flesh, right? So what's the difference? Flesh, like meat, is something which absorbs. You cook meat, it absorbs the water, absorbs the sauce, right? Stone doesn't absorb anything; it's just everything slips off. That's a leiv ha'evan. In other words, leiv ha'evan means you have the chassidus, you have the mindset, you have the everything's in your head, it's all fine, but the heart's not absorbing it, right? Because there's timtum halev, it's a blockage of the heart. All right. She says, what do you do about this? Right? What do you do about this? This is the strategy that's given in the Zohar. The Omar Rav says, the Omar Rav Mesifta Began Eden. The teacher, the leader of the Academy of Gan Eden, says the Zohar says the following: a plank, a log, a piece of wood that the fire will not catch. You have to break it up. So again, let's just summarize here. I just want to summarize very quickly because otherwise the rest is not going to make sense. So, all right, we're starting a new parak. We're talking about a new problem that a Benini has. Not sadness, that was the last few chapters, but there's a problem of timtum halev, the blockage of the heart. That just somehow Benini knows everything. Even Averis is easy to control, but very hard to be awakened, inspired by davening. He's got it all in his head, but it's not being absorbed by the heart, right? Or sometimes what that leads to is, he says, even it's very hard to do the war, to overcome the temptation of indulgence, because that's the biggest struggle in not doing an Avera. So we said before, not doing an Avera, the person knows something is against Hashem, he's not going to do it. But to overcome the war of not indulging in things that are permissible, not being kedusha, not being holy in things that are permissible, that's much, much harder. And Benini, even a Benini for sure, a person less than a Benini, but a Benini for sure finds it very difficult. Why? Because the heart is blocked. So what's the strategy? So this is what the Zohar says. Zohar says like this: if you have a log, right? If you have a piece of wood, and you try to light it, and it doesn't absorb, it doesn't catch fire, which is the case many times, right? If you make a barbecue, a big log is going to be very difficult to. You need small pieces. What do they call them? Chips or something, right? That you got to light, right? I'm not a big barbecue, but apparently that's how it works. Even for beer chametz, I can't know how to make a fire. I have to get someone else to do it. But anyway, but apparently you got a light piece of paper for small chips, and then it spreads and it catches, right? So the Zohar says that a wood that it doesn't catch, you gotta break it up. It's only one way. Now, what does it mean? Maybe you need a bigger fire, right? You need a bigger fire. So, in other words, like this. Obviously, what he's going to talk about is the wood in this case is the nefesh habamis, and it's not catching fire, so you got to break it up a little bit. But maybe not. Maybe you just need a bigger fire. So first of all, there's two things there. I've looked in like the commentaries of Tanya. I see two ideas. First of all, the Benny doesn't necessarily have a bigger fire. That's his fire, and it's a good fire. He's got a really, really good fire. He doesn't have a stronger fire. That's on his level. That's the fire he's reached. Nothing wrong with it. Just that's his madrega, and that fire is not catching. So you've got to do something for the nefesh habamis to catch on, right? And also, not always a bigger fire helps. If you've got a really, really big wood that's very dry, and it's a piece of a big log, you can add fire, but it's not going to help. It just doesn't catch fire. It's too big, right? So therefore, the only strategy is you've got to break up the fire. Yeah, break up the wood. Sorry, right? Okay. So he says like this, what is it? That's the moshel, that's the parable, that's what the Zohar says. Pirush, what's the explanation? No, hoyrad the nishmasa. The fire is the fire of the neshama. Sha'oir ha-neshama, the light of the neshama. V'haseichel einoi meir kol kach. It's just not burning so strongly. Limshol, to have control af al chumriya saguf, on the coarseness of the body. Right? A person can be in a situation where in his brain he understands well, he's learned lots of chassidus, and he learned Kabbalah, and he's learned all the good things, B'gedulas Hashem, and he really understands the greatness of Hashem in a really, really big way. Nevertheless, somehow in a nitpas v'nidmak v'moichoy kol kach, it's not even grabbed in his brain so much, B'gedulas Hashem, sheyuchal limshal achum yisalev, that it can have any effect on the coarseness and the materialism of the heart. Machmas chumriyusan vegasusan, right? Because of the coarseness and, I don't know, it's different words, the physicality of it and the coarseness of it. Just not catching on. Why? The neshama is doing well. He understands the Gadlus Hashem. He understands everything, but it's not catching. What's the reason? Gasus haklipa. It's the coarseness of klippa that a person has within him. Shemagbiya atzma. That he lifts himself up. Al oir kedushas nefesh elokis, on the light of the holiness of the nefesh elokis. Umasteres umachsheich oir, just blocking the light. And it's not absorbing it. Because like a big plank of wood, it's just not absorbing it. It's not absorbing the fire. Okay, now. The next part is going to tell us what we have to do about it. We have to give a couple of introductions. So first of all, what does he mean because of the klippa? First of all, like this. When he talks about the physicality and the coarseness and we call in Yiddish the grobkeit of the klippa that he has within him, it's not talking about the body, the physical body. We have to differentiate here. The body is just a vessel, that's all it is about. The body is a vessel, whatever you put in it, it's going to work. Right? It's important to understand this because soon we're going to learn about bashing up the nefesh habamis, and we certainly do not mean harming the body in any way. Especially the Baal Shem Tov came along and says, no, avodas Hashem, the service of Hashem is to bring the body on the train, to elevate the body, right? Baal Shem Tov famously said upon the pasuk, there's a pasuk that says, it's a mitzvah, one of the mitzvahs in the Torah, that when you see a donkey of your enemy even, and it's overloaded and it's and you might refrain from helping your friend, it says Ozov Tazim, you should help him with him, work with him, because that's the halacha. If he's not on the way and he doesn't want to do anything, he says you go load my donkey for me or unload my donkey for me. You don't have to do that. It's about doing it with him, right? So Baal Shem Tov translated the pasuk in a Hasidic way, and he said, Kisira chamor, when you see chamor, chumris, when you see the coarseness of your body. There he's talking about the body, the physical body. And you'll see that sometimes it is your enemy. It's not letting you serve Hashem properly. It's Kashmir, it's physical. You might think that you're going to go against him and fight him. You're not going to help him. No, Ozot Taz Imai, bring him along with. That's why the Rebbe used to be, especially in our generation, when we weaker generations, the Rebbe used to talk a lot about the Baal Shem Tov and his philosophy. How today we should not increase in fasting, other than the fast that halachically we have to fast. We shouldn't fast, even though fasting is brought down in Kabbalah as a way of tshuva. Okay, that's for people who could do it and not ruin their body in the same time. But if it's going to affect your health, no, the body has to come with you. It's not good. The body has to be healthy. The body has to be able to be a keli for serving Hashem. What he's more talking about here is the nefesh habamis, right? So we did this at the very, very beginning of Tanya, and it goes back to the very first chapter of Tanya. First chapter of Tanya says, when it talks about, he gives an introduction about the whole Gemara, about tzaddikim, benyanim, rishayim. He asks a whole bunch of questions. You okay? A whole bunch of questions, and then he says we have to understand what a benyanim is, and it can't really be a person who's 50% of areas it's from Isis. That can't be. He brings proofs from the Gemara. Remember that right from the beginning of Tanya. And after he's finished with all the questions, he says, okay, now let's get into it. What's his first introduction? He says that the first introduction is Shalachol Ish Yisrael. Every single Jew has two souls. The nefesh elokis, nefesh habamis. But he says first he explains nefesh habamis. And let's just read the words because it's such an important thing to understand that. And just with one introduction to what we're reading these words, because in the Gemara we learn the fact that we have an internal war, that is not the chidush of Tanya. That's not Tanya's innovation. That's the Gemara. I mean, the Gemara says we have a yetzer tov and a yetzer hara. Evil inclination, a good inclination. Right? That's not what Tanya talks about. Tanya's talking about a step before the inclinations. And that is the nefesh habamis and the nefesh elokis. Now, where do we see that? Because he says, in the very beginning, he says, every Yid, whether it's a tzaddik or a rasha, has two souls. Right? Which are? He says, nefesh achas, the first soul we're talking about, comes from klippa and sitra achra. Right? And it's mislabish, it goes into the blood of the person, lahachir saguf, to keep the body alive. Okay? And it's klippa and sitra achra, he says, right? And he says, and then he continues that all the bad midos come from there. But the first point of Tanya is we have a nefesh habamis, which is klippa. And the question is, why is it klippa? It didn't do anything wrong yet. It's just born. Right? It's in the blood of the baby, giving it life. Why is it klippa? And the answer is, it goes to the heart of Tanya. Tanya Chassidus, and Tanya particularly, is about, we learned this in 20 and 21, we learned it in the second part of Tanya, is about Achdus Hashem, about the oneness of Hashem. That everything in the world intrinsically might be hidden from us, but intrinsically it's godliness. Right? Which means that everything that conceals godliness, even in the most slightest and delicate of ways, is klippa. By definition. Right? When a baby is born, it's a big mazel tov because it has neshama, but when the baby is born, right? And his nefesh habamis is there, nefesh habamis is klippa. Why is it klippa? Because the fact that it exists is already klippa. The fact that it exists as something which appears to be a separate entity from godliness means it's klippa. Might be a refined klippa, might be a klippa that's easy to overcome, whatever the case is, but it's a klippa, right? And the klippa gets worse with time because with time it breeds bad midas because it comes from klippa, it's ego, and so on. And then, as he says, where did he say? He said, I think we learned it before. No, there's another. Yeah, there was a good expression previously in Tanya that actually a Benny needs to know that the war. Oh yeah, when he talks about the war will never cease; it'll always be there. And on the contrary, in some cases, the struggle between nefesh and nefesh habamis gets worse. Why? Because nefesh habamis, with time, we keep eating, we keep feeding a nefesh habamis, and we keep doing physical things that are materialistic, necessary, not always godly. And all the nefesh habamis just become stronger and stronger all the time. But essentially, nefesh habamis is klippa right from the start. Now, when that klippa becomes emboldened,
everything from Atzilus down.
well, it depends because that's another discussion to a certain degree. Because in Bria there's an existence, and therefore it's the way after Atzilus you have Bria Tzir Asir. The way Kabbalah puts it is the following, and it's brought on Chassidus. that Bria is mostly good, a little bit of bad. Yitzira is half-half, and Asiya is mostly bad. What that means is like this. Yeah, Bria is not like Atzilus, therefore there's some bad in it. What do you mean? It's in existence really. But in Atzilus it's so spiritual, in Bria it's so spiritual, the Malachim are so high there, that the bittul there is unbelievable. So they feel the bittul too. They feel themselves as an existence. The Malach of Bria exists, but it's completely bottled to Hashem in a very conscious way, and therefore it's mostly good, mostly not Klippa. Yitzira, but Dalil in this world, in Asiyah, and in this world it says this world is described in Chassidus as being a place that's mole klippas v'sitra achra, that's filled with klippa and sitra achra. What does it mean, filled with sitra achra? It means because this world, for the most part, you don't see godliness in a conscious way. Every part of this physical world hides godliness, conceals godliness, which is why it's a world that's full of klippa and sitra achra. The greatness that we have is that we can subjugate that, as we said last year. Or the other translation, what did we say last week? Control it or get it under control, or whatever the case is. Or not give in to it, right? Whatever the lotion is. Iskafi, in other words, okay? Okay, and that's an amazing thing. That's what Hashem wants us to do. That's the struggle of the BINA. But its default position is, now, the clip that we have within us sometimes is so big that it becomes like a very, very big log of wood that the fire doesn't take hold. Right? Yeah? Now, next introduction before we get to the next part is like this. He's going to talk about it. He's going to go back and forth now a little bit, but let's talk about it outside first. Who is the real person? This is the question. Who is the real person? Nefesh Elokis or Nefesh Abamis? Right? Sorry? What does that mean?
It's not one or the other.
But we have a consciousness. When I say I, what do I mean? Well, the BINA says I, what does it mean? So, in this parak, for the most part, he's going to say that the I of a person is a Nefesh Abamis. Right? But we need to put that in context because it's not so simple. Because we learn in Chassidus like this. First of all, we learn that every Yid has a neshama, and that's the real him. The pnimius of a Yid is the neshama. That's what we always talk about, right? We talk about it before Rosh Hashanah a lot, right? Who's the real you? Not my failings, not my klippas, right? Not only that, it's explained in many, many places like this, that even by a Yid, it's different to a non-Jew. Even by Yid, even the physical life that we have actually comes to the Nefesh Elokis through the Nefesh Abamis. But actually the source of the physical chayas of a Yid comes to the Nefesh Elokis. Right? Okay, the Nefesh Abamis is always the conduit for physical sustenance, but nevertheless, the Nefesh Abamis is not the source of our life. It's not what's actually keeping us alive. It is what's carrying the flow of our continued aliveness, right? But nevertheless, our life actually comes to the Nefesh Elokis. And where do you see this? Where do you see this in a halacha? We've quoted this before, but it's a fascinating halacha. The halacha is that the Gemara talks about certain cases where a person is supposed to do a certain mitzvah. Like there are cases that it's a mitzvah, or halacha says that the husband must give his wife a get. Yeah? There are certain korbanos, and it has to be willingly. We have a pi halacha, what's called a get me'usa. A forced get is not a get. A husband must give it willingly. Yeah? Which, by the way, has tremendous ramifications today because there's a huge body of halachic literature about, nowadays there's been I'm going to tell you a side thing, it's interesting. Nowadays there's been a big discussion about prenups. Right? Because unfortunately we have our goodness, we have trained women and they have a very bad divorce, and then one of the things the husband does to keep control is refuses to give a get, right? So there's prenups, there's different ways of doing a prenup. But a prenup basically is that there'll be penalties in the secular court for not giving a get. Maybe it'll be big fines every day or court orders, what kind of things like that, right? And there's a lot, and that could certainly help. You know, it's not worthwhile for the husband not to give a get because he's going to end up with huge financial penalties, whatever the case. It's a whole idea to prevent husbands chaining their wives not giving a get, right? But it's not so simple because there's a huge body of literature which questions the way it's done. And there's different suggestions between different Batei Din in America and things like that. Because sometimes if you do it, essentially you force him to give the get because now he's in a pickle. There could be a shaila of a forced get. The forced get is a big problem. Okay, there are many, many ways of doing it. There's one way of structuring it that actually you don't force him to give the get legally. What you do is you say, as long as he withholds the get, he's got to go to court or something like that. And then the court can do whatever they want. The court can impose penalties, the court can impose a fine, whatever. There's different ways of structuring. Okay. He doesn't have to go to court. He doesn't have to go. It's like, but if he doesn't want to give the get, he's going to have to go to court. But I don't know. I'm not sure exact details, but it's a very fascinating area of halachic law. Anyways, but it's all around preventing the idea of structuring a prenup so we make sure the get is given, but leaving room that it's actually a choice because it shouldn't be a forced get. A forced get's a big problem. Suddenly, the Gemara says that there's a certain case where if al pi halacha, it's now a mitzvah. There are situations where just people are getting divorced. It's not a mitzvah to get divorced. There are situations where it's gone far enough, or the husband did something wrong, or whatever. There's many examples where, within a short time, it can be now established not that you can give a get, but al pi halacha you have to give a get. Right? In such a case, says the Gemara, koifin oisa, you beat the guy up until he says, yes, I want. Right? It's a famous Gemara. Rambam brings it down also. The Rambam explains it. And he says, so Rambam asks a question, like, this is ridiculous. What do you mean you beat him up? By the way, not recommended today because you'll land in jail yourself. But in Eretz Yisrael they do this. In Israel where laws of kiddushin, marriage and divorce are under the Beis Din, not under the courts. You know that, right? Legal marriage and legal divorce in Eretz Yisrael is run by the Beis Din, run by the Rabbanut essentially, right? With all its problems, but that's the way it is, okay? And they have the power, they have legal power, and they sometimes when they establish someone has to give his wife a get and refuses to do that, and they'll put the person in jail, right? They can actually imprison someone. I mean, nothing's absolutely foolproof because there are psychopaths that will sit in jail for 20 years not give their wives a get just to it's happened, it has happened, but nothing you can do, okay? But nevertheless, right? It certainly is a good deterrent. And they have to establish that it's al pi halacha, the person has to give a get, and then they can actually arrest him and put him in jail, or do other sanctions, whatever the case is. But here we say that you can beat him up. Says Rambam, what do you mean? We know that a get cannot be a get musa, cannot be a forced get. You have to be willingly, right? So what do you mean you beat him up until he says I want? And the Rambam explains very simple. A yid wants to do a mitzvah. A yid wants to keep halacha. That is the default of a Jew. Very simple. It's the default of a Jew. He wants. Once it becomes halachically established that he has to give a get al pi halacha, that's what he wants to do. Now, where does that come from? That want from his neshama. What's blocking the want? The klippa in him, the guf, right? Okay, so he beat up the nefesh habam, he beat up the guf, and the real rotzen comes out. So when he says I want, it's true. And it's not just a nice philosophical idea; it's a halacha. It actually, right? Which teaches us what is a yid? The yid wants to do a mitzvah. He wants to serve Hashem. That's the yid. That's the essence of a yid. That's ultimately where his physical chayas comes from. That's ultimately what his rotzen is. A yid is really the nefesh elokis. And that's the basis of tshuva, that's the basis of all these things that we talk about. That's why we talked about before that a yid will give up his life for avodah zarah, because that's what a yid is, right? But that's not what he's talking about in this parak.
We just understood that.
Yes, that's good. And that's true. However, and this is the mistake people make sometimes. The Alter Rebbe makes it very clear, right? That is true. It's true, but it's hidden. It's true in a subconscious way. Okay, so you beat the guy up, so you take away his consciousness. That's fine, and therefore his subconscious comes out. That's good in that halacha. But in terms of how we walk around each day, if we're honest with ourselves, when we say the I means my nefesh habamis, because consciously, that's what I want. My default position is to do what my nefesh habamis wants. Right? Unless I've worked in it, unless I've I'm controlling the nefesh habamis. But actually it's a daily struggle, right? Every single day a person gets up, the Yetzer Hara says, why don't you shlof? Very simple. Especially if it's cold outside, right? It always, okay, if you've worked on it, then you'll put in the effort. You'll say, no, I know that's not true. My mind tells me not so. I'm getting up and I'm going to shul. All right, that's good. But the you said, sleep in bed. Right? When there's a temptation to get angry, you have Shabbat, so once you get angry. My default is to get angry. My consciousness is to get angry. My nefesh halakis doesn't want me to get angry. My nefesh halakis in the background. It's that's part of the BINA war. I've got to bring a nefesh halakis to the forefront. Right? So therefore you need to know, it depends what you're talking about. There's a famous expression in Chassidus, in Yiddish. It was always like, it's it depends where you're talking. It depends what context you're talking about. If you're talking about the true and ultimate, and he brings it later himself. If you're talking about the true and ultimate essence of what a Yid is, of course it's a nefesh halakis. But if you're talking about the I on a conscious day-to-day level, the I is a nefesh habamis. Even by a Beinani. How much more so those of us who are quite far from a Beinani. Okay? Therefore, and that's very important to understand here. Now, so therefore he talks, now what he's going to talk about now is tough, as I said last week. Okay, so this is like this. So what does he have to do? So my nefesh habamis now is a big piece of wood. That's a big piece of wood, therefore it's actually hard to win the war because the fire of the nefesh halakis is not taking hold. So the Zohar says, what do you do when the fire doesn't take hold? You've got to chop up the wood. Therefore he says, what are you going to do? You've got to, he says, again, it's the gas, the cause of this is the gas klippa, the coarseness of the klippa that lifts it up higher than the kedusha, than the holiness nefesh halakis, u'mesateres machsheicha oirin, and it hides its light. Therefore, what are you going to do? Therefore, you got to grind your nefesh habamis and beat it down to dust. That's what you got to do. Chop it up. What does that mean? Dahainu. What it means like this: likvoya itim, to designate times. That's a very important discussion now. Very important expression, I mean. Because what it's about to say, one can make a mistake, and this is got to do all day, every day, and you'll be a wreck if you do this. Because you're not supposed to. You have to be besimcha all the time, right? But he says we do need to set aside time, once in a while, to reflect on the lowliness of who I am. The lowliness of the nefesh habamis, which for the meantime is me. Right? And we have this concept in Yiddishkeit even before Chassidus. The Shulchan Aruch says before one davens, you're supposed to reflect on two things. Interesting thing. Reflect on two things. Gadlus Sokel, the greatness of God, for Shiflus Ha'adam, and the lowliness of man. Why? Because if I'm coming into davening with arrogance, even if I know the greatness of God, it's not going to take hold at all. My davening is not going to be, it's just not going to catch. So you need to put yourself down a little bit. But he says over here, it's ligboya itim. You have to set aside times for it. Not all day, every day. That's not the way to do it. But there are times you have to reflect on that, of the truth of that, right? And he says, what does it mean? You have to break it down and beat it down and bring it down to dust. Again, to set aside times, to lower yourself. Almost to become like, it's a very, very sharp expression. This nivz be'enov means to like to be in your own eyes, like repulsive in your own eyes. Nimas, kakos, like the pasuk says. Pasuk says, "V'leiv nishbar v'ruach nishbara." David HaMelech talks about a broken heart, right? Being the ultimate korban to Hashem. What are we breaking? We're breaking the sitra achra. That's what we're breaking, the klippa. And that sitra achra says, the Alter Rebbe, this is what I was talking about before in the introduction, Shehi, ha'odom atzmai, that's the person. Breaking the klippa is not breaking some foreign idea that you have nothing to do with. Breaking the klippa means breaking yourself. Because that's who you are for the time being. Right? The Beinani. Especially with the Beinani. Shenefesh ha'chiyuni samachaya aguf. Because the material neshama, nefesh habamis in other words, which is giving life to the body, betokfa keteldosa, is as strong as it is, or even stronger maybe, but it's as strong for sure as when it was born. Believe it in your heart. Nimtza it's found, nimtza, which means he ha'adam atzmai. That is the person himself. And then from time to time, you've got to beat up the nefesh habamis, which means beat up yourself. In a positive way, we're talking about, right? And later on in Tanya, he'll say how you can have those two thoughts at the same time. You can be besimcha and beat yourself up at the same time, because coming from different sides of your heart, and a yid can carry both things. But is that concept, right? Then he claims it. He says this idea. He says, "Nefesh halakis." When we talk about the nefesh halakis, sheboy nemar, we say, he proves this. Every day in the morning brachas, what do we say? There's a bracha we say in the morning brachas, Elokai neshama shenasata bi. Right? We say the neshama you gave me is pure. You gave it to me. You're protecting it, etc. Right? What do we say? We say neshama shenasata bi tohirahi. The neshama you gave me is pure. But look at the language. Shenasata bi. The neshama that you put into me. Who's the me? Nefesh abamis. Right? The neshama that you placed into me is that bidaika. Miklal, which means she'adam matzma ena neshama tohira. That the neshama is not the pure neshama is not you. The you, at least the conscious you for now, is the nefesh abamis. Right? Unless you're a tzaddik. What does he mean? Because he brings an interesting thing about tzaddik. Tzaddikim is different. True tzaddikim we're talking about. Tzaddikim, the way Tanya explains tzaddikim, right? That's opposite. What's a tzaddik? A tzaddik is someone who's completely transformed his nefesh abamis. To what? To be completely permeated by the nefesh halakis. On a conscious level. The tzaddik is someone, he explained before in Tanya, who is resistant to anything that hides elokos. Anything that conceals godliness and not godly is completely resistant to it. He hates it. He's permeated in a permanent way with love of Hashem and bittul towards Hashem, right? So that's different. The neshama tohira, the pure neshama, she nefesh halakis, hu adam. The person, the consciousness of the person by tzaddik is the neshama. Right? The gufam and their body, nikra is called, there's an expression is called, it's a pasuk called psar adam, the flesh of man. What do you mean the flesh of man? So who's the man? The flesh is the man. No, the flesh of man by tzaddik means the flesh is the flesh of the man. Who's the man? The neshama. There's just the flesh of the man. It's completely the opposite way around. The guf of the tzaddik is just, the guf of a regular person is just a vehicle of the nefesh abamis. The guf of the tzaddik is a guf of carries the nefesh halakis and that transforms nefesh abamis. Right? It brings a medrash which says an interesting thing. Kamaimer Hillel HaZaken, like Hillel HaZaken said to Talmidov. Hillel HaZaken said to his students, it says in the medrash, K'shahoya hoylech lecho, when he would go to eat, when it was time to eat, Hillel said the following. Hoya Omer used to say, Shehu hoylech ligmol chesed u'maluva v'aniyah. I'm now going to bestow kindness on the destitute and the poor one. It means I am going to feed my body. Not I'm going to eat, I'm going to feed my body. Because the eye is the nefesh halakis, right? Hugufoy, because he was talking about the body. Why? Because for him it was like a body was just strange. It was a foreigner, the body. Like us, the neshama is a foreigner, the guf was a foreigner. Omar, that's why he said, right? When he would bestow kindness, the fact that he's feeding him, what's him? Him the nefesh halakis, levad. Ki levados, only the nefesh halakis. That's machaya gufay upsore, that is giving life to his body and his flesh in the nefesh in the tzaddik's case. Shara shoy benafshach yunus. If there's any bad or any clipper that he had in his soul, hamanabeshas bedama upsore, nishapich letoiv is being transformed to good. The nichal bigdushas nefesh halakis just become part of the nefesh halakis. The nefesh abamis by tzaddik is just an extension of the nefesh halakis. Avul bebeinani. But by this is in tzaddikim. Al bebeini, but by bebeini ma'achar shabus v'atzmus shenefesh achinas abamis sheb'sitrach v'abash b'dome upsori v'alabeini, because the nefesh abamis which is in the blood of the person has not been transformed. His thought, speech, and action is controlled, but his nefesh abamis has not been transformed at all. Right? Nepach has not become good. He or adam atzma. Therefore, that's the person, and therefore he needs to remember who am I? I'm a person who's rochek ma Hashem betachli sarichuk. I am distant from Hashem. I am very distant from Hashem. That's part of the tshuva process also, right? How does tshuva work? When we talk about Elu, we learn all the Chassidus and tshuva. There's a part of tshuva that really is very tough. The part of tshuva where that's the shofar. The shofar is like the cry of the neshama. Crying, it's so distant from Hashem. But right? It's not a bad thing, it's just an uncomfortable thing. Because that leads to proper tshuva, it leads to love of Hashem. It's the yearning, but it's a yearning that comes from the feeling that I'm so far away. I'm not even so far away, I got the terrible things. I'm so far away by being. Just because I have a nefesh habamis. Could be that's what Abishta created me, but that doesn't matter. I'm yearning because I'm far away. Because that's me, I'm the nefesh habamis. And not only that, what type of nefesh habamis do I have? I know that the power of will. The nefesh habamis says, who's the me? Now that I know the nefesh habamis is me, who's this nefesh habamis? It's a power of will, it's a rotzen, it's a taiva. And it's possible for nefesh habamis even to instill in me a desire to do prohibited things, which are mameshem keneged ritzonis barach, that are mamash against Hashem. Even though the Bain doesn't want to do them, he doesn't actually do them, right? He's not going to actually do it. He will never do an avera. How much more so those that are less than the Bain, right? But he's like upset. Why? But it's not disgusting by him to do an avera. He won't do it because he knows the truth. But the fact that the me, the I, which is my consciousness when Nefesh Habamis, wants to do an avera, like it makes me feel very far, right? It's all part of the process of like beating up the Nefesh Habamis. The Muslim has be'emes ke b'tzadikim like b'tzadikim b'shiz b'olel. Okay. And with this, I'm just thinking I should do this piece now. And I'll stop you. I'll just tell you something interesting. It's going to get harder and harder. So it's good, soft launch. Right? Again, I always refer back to Chassidim who really lived this idea, lived Tanya, right? They would do this, right? They would do this properly. There was times they would sit down and they would do. I told you, my Zaydis always tell me about the Chassidim Dakshis who would cry bitter tears every day by davening. Or other Chassidim that would cry when they would say Krishma at night and reflect on the day. This is part of what they did. Like, they would think about, they would beat up the Nefesh Habamis a little bit, right? And yet they were the happiest people. Just they were always happy. I guess not in that hour, but they were always happy, right? Or even in that hour, because I'll never talk later that actually you can be both at the same time. Because it's a necessary step and it's a painful step to come to terms and to confront the distance that we have with Hashem. Especially as he goes on to say that if we're not completely clean from doing things wrong, now he's saying that you have that distance even if you never did anything wrong, because just the fact that you exist means you're part of the Klippa world, and that's you, that's your consciousness. Right? But it was always seen as a step of connection. In other words, it's a very confronting process to actually put this into place, and it's painful. I would say it's a painful process because that's what it results. If you really learn about Hashem and you really learn about a connection to Hashem, and that becomes a part of your life, and then to reflect that you're so distant from Hashem. I mean, it comes obviously from understanding everything in Chassidus. It's not painful if the connection to Hashem doesn't bother you. Right, obviously. But he's talking about someone who is bothered by it. He's trying to daven. He's trying to connect and it's not catching. So you got to know, because your neshama is good, but the problem is that your nefesh habamis is a big piece of wood. It's not taking fire. It's coarse, it's big, it has a lot of chutzpah. So you got to beat it up. And the way to beat it up in order to catch fire is that reflection of the distance, the klippa, and who we are and who we really are. Right? So once you understand, once you've come to because obviously the person who's doing this has already learned and he's already internalized in his brain at least in a mindset of how important it is to be connected to Hashem, and how the connection to Hashem is the only real meaningful entity and existence and connection that exists, right? So therefore you embark on this process that should take hold in your heart and in everything. And it's a painful process, a confronting process. But when you understand that the confronting process is to achieve, it's not a despair, I'm a creation that's just distant from Hashem. You understand that it's a process to painfully confront in order for the fire to take hold, in order that you should be able to then become closer to HaKadosh Baruch Hu, then it's painful, but it's not inducing of despair. And that's why you realize afterwards, wow, this nothing, this shtick behemoth that I am, and yet nevertheless Hashem is giving me a path how to connect to Him, even by being in Nefesh Abamis. That should bring tremendous simcha. That's why it's the same thing we learned before. That's the chapter in Tehillim where the David HaMelech talks about a broken heart. This is what he's talking about, this process. And right after that he says, Hashem, tashme'eni, sasim simcha. Make me hear gladness and joy. Because the ultimate is simcha. But true simcha is about meaning and purpose. True simcha is about connection to HaKadosh Baruch Hu. So sometimes in order to get there, you got to go through this process. Right? But it's a true thing, and it's a really important thing. You know, how we all do it will depend on who we are, I suppose, and how intense it is. And obviously, as we get lower and lower, or weaker and weaker in our generations, the emphasis becomes much more on the joy than this thing. But it is a mindset to have, to know who we are. And it's a mistake a lot of people make. Oh, I've heard people talk about this and give Shurim and Tanya, they kind of conveniently forget this chapter somehow. Right? And always talk about, Chassidus is all about the real you, it's just the neshama. If it's all about love, you shouldn't judge yourself, you shouldn't judge others. Not judging others is a good idea, but first of all, we can push others, but we should surely, yes, judge ourselves. On one level. We have to confront the klippa within us. That's a fact. Right? Obviously, when we educate children, obviously when we bring up people, part of the process is also educating ourselves and others of who we really are. Different story. And sometimes the view when you bring someone is different. I know I saw by the Rabbi that whole idea, right? That when you bring someone who's very far from Yiddishkeit, or even feels that they've just gone and they're not connected or something like that, then of course you don't start with this parak. That's not going to be very helpful. That's why the Rebbe's view is, no, you got to look at the Yids. You find the Yid who you think has no connection to Yiddishkeit, especially look at someone else, you actually have to X-ray right through, past the klippa, and look at the neshama. Because ultimately that is the real person, on a self-conscious way.
But that klippa isn't stopping him from connecting.
Stopping him, but when you can... Yeah, but you see, the thing is like this. You see, this parak comes after the previous chapters, right? Now it's like this. If I beat up a person that I meet because I want to break his klippa, but he hasn't yet met his neshama, it's like breaking up a log of wood, but you have no flame. Right? Just because you broke up a log, it's not going to burn because there's no light there. There's no fire there. So sometimes the way to do it is, yes, the person can be heavily involved in klippa. But you've got to tell him, you know what? You actually have a fire. That's number one. You have a fire. A big fire. And in fact, on the deepest level, that fire is the real you. Okay, now, you got to... Right? That's what I was thinking, like, again, I say I learned from the Rebbe was sometimes much harsher on the Chassidim than he was on completely irreligious people. Right? Because the religious person, you got to understand, it's not his fault. He didn't have education, whatever the case is. But he has to meet his neshama. With the Chassidim, I guess the Rebbe was, you met your neshama, now break your klippas, so you should be able to do something. Right? And you're ready for that. In general, I think I've told you this, that by Hasidim it was always known that when the Rebbe showed you a kiru, which means he showed you a closeness, Hasidim used to worry.
You needed it.
Yeah, if you got a kiruv, it means you needed a kiruv. And the biggest compliment you get after the Rebbe is the Rebbe gives you a sharp answer. Like, what are you thinking? Are you crazy? Like that was the biggest compliment. That means the Rebbe thinks I can handle it, right? Rabbi Yoel Khan, one of the greatest Hasidim, right? I remember a few times the Rebbe wanted to do something, he was taking too much time. Without using his name, the Rebbe spoke about him in public. Gave him a telling off in public. Didn't say his name, it was obvious he was talking about it, but... And it's fine. I saw my father, I was going through my father's letters from the Rebbe. I still can't decipher one thing exactly where it came from. My mother told me one version doesn't quite fit with what the context is. But anyway, I have to still figure out one day. But then I was upset with him for something. He didn't write often enough or something. I don't know exactly. Right? No, he was a chassid. Then once wrote, he sent him a letter. On the third letter, he said something, dot, ad masai, until we're not going to have to wait for this. Then I would never write to that on a person that was like irreligious or something, or hasn't had a connection. Because there is this process. You got to be ready for it. But you know what I'm saying? Like, so obviously we have to make sure that Al Rebbe is telling us we have to do this, but also we have to do it properly. We have to do it. If we do it and it just makes us give up, then we're not doing it correctly. So first we have to learn about the neshama. We have to learn about in Perek Yud Ches that we have hidden love for Hashem, and that's who we really are, and that's the neshama, and the whole thing. And we give up Mesiras Nefesh for Avodah Zarah. That's a Yid is. We've learned a lot about that. We've up until now we've encountered the neshama a little bit, not nowhere near. But I'm saying. But now the Alter was telling you now. But if you're wondering why what you've met hasn't taken hold, it's because there is this process too. All right.